The wind cut through Mary's worn shawl like a knife as she stepped out into the gray morning. Winter in Texas wasn't supposed to be this harsh, but 1867 had brought nothing but surprises, and most of them bad. She pulled the door tight behind her, listening for any sound from inside the small cabin where her children still slept. 6 months. That's how long it had been since the fever took her husband Thomas. 6 long months of trying to keep their little farm running, of pretending she knew what she was doing, of lying awake at night wondering how much longer they could survive out here alone. Mary wrapped her arms around herself and looked out at the land that stretched endlessly in every direction. When Thomas was alive, this place felt like freedom. Now it felt like a prison with no walls, just miles and miles of emptiness between her and the nearest neighbor. The Johnsons lived 5 miles east, but they had their own troubles. Everyone did these days. She picked up the bucket from beside the door and headed toward the well. The chickens needed feeding, the cow needed milking, and those fence posts on the north side weren't going to fix themselves. Thomas always said a good fence was the difference between keeping your livestock and feeding the wolves. She'd been putting off checking that section for weeks, but winter storms had a way of finding the weak spots. The pump handle was stiff with cold, and Mary had to work it hard to get the water flowing. Her hands were already numb, even though the sun was just starting to peek over the horizon. She thought about Thomas's hands, how strong they were, how they never seemed to feel the cold. He'd grown up on a farm back in Missouri, knew all the tricks for surviving harsh weather. Mary had grown up in town, the daughter of a shopkeeper. Everything she knew about farming, she'd learned from watching Thomas. After filling the bucket, she headed to the chicken coop. The hens were huddled together for warmth, making soft clucking sounds as she scattered their feed. At least they were laying better now that the worst of the cold snap had passed. She gathered 8 eggs, which would be enough for breakfast, and maybe one left over for later. The cow, Bessie, gave her a look that seemed to say, "About time," when Mary finally made it to the barn. Thomas had picked Bessie out himself 3 years ago, said she had kind eyes and would be a good producer. He was right on both counts. Even now, with hay running low and the pasture brown and brittle, Bessie still gave them enough milk to get by. Mary settled into the familiar rhythm of milking, the warm barn offering some relief from the wind outside. This was always when her mind wandered, when the worry crept in. The corn harvest hadn't been good last fall. Thomas got sick right when they should have been bringing in the crop, and by the time she figured out what needed doing, half of it was ruined by early frost. The money from selling what they could salvage was almost gone. She'd been stretching it as far as possible, but winter wasn't even half over yet. There were supplies they needed from town, but town was a 2-day ride, and she couldn't leave the children alone that long. The Johnsons had offered to help, but they had 5 kids of their own and barely enough to feed them. When Mary finished milking, she stood in the barn doorway for a moment, looking out at the fence line that stretched across the north pasture. She could see from here that several posts were leaning and there were gaps where the wire had come loose. If she didn't fix it soon, Bessie might wander off looking for better grass, and they couldn't afford to lose her. She left the milk in the barn where it would stay cool and headed back to the cabin. The children would be waking up soon, and they'd want breakfast. 8-year-old Lucy was old enough to help with simple tasks, but she was still just a child. 6-year-old Ben tried to be helpful, but mostly he just got in the way. They both missed their father terribly, though they tried to be brave for her sake. Inside, the cabin felt warm after the cold morning air. Mary stirred up the coals in the fireplace and added some kindling to get the fire going again. The coffee was yesterday's, reheated, but it was hot and strong enough to help clear her head. She cracked 4 of the eggs into the skillet and sliced some bread from the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. Lucy appeared first, her dark hair sticking up in all directions. She looked so much like Thomas that it made Mary's heart ache sometimes. "Morning, Mama," Lucy said, rubbing her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart. Can you wake your brother while I finish breakfast?" Lucy nodded and padded back toward the small room, where Ben was still curled up under his blankets. Mary heard her whisper, "Come on, Ben, Mama's got eggs ready." They ate quietly, the way they'd been eating since Thomas died. There used to be conversation at breakfast, Thomas telling them what he planned to work on that day, making the children laugh with stories about the chickens or jokes about Bessie's stubborn moods. Now meals were just about getting enough food. To start the day after breakfast, Mary bundled the children up warm and set them to small tasks around the cabin while she prepared to check the fence. Lucy could sweep the floors and tidy up. Ben could stack firewood by the door, though she'd have to restack most of it properly later. "I'm going to look at the fence posts," she told them. "Stay close to the cabin. If anyone comes by, you come get me right away, understand?" Both children nodded solemnly. They'd learned to be cautious about strangers. Most folks who passed through were decent enough, but there were others, men who'd lost everything in the war and turned mean, drifters looking for easy targets. Sometimes even Indians who'd been pushed off their land and weren't happy about it. Mary picked up Thomas's tool bag and headed out across the pasture. The grass crunched under her feet, still frozen from the night's cold. The fence line ran for about a quarter-mile, following the natural rise of the land. Thomas had built it strong, but 3 years of weather and the occasional cow rubbing against it had taken their toll. She was about halfway along when she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. At first, she thought it was just shadows playing tricks, maybe some deadwood that had blown against the fence during the last storm. But as she got closer, her heart started pounding. There was a man tied to one of her fence posts. Mary's first instinct was to run. Every story she'd ever heard about Indian raids, about settlers being attacked and worse, came flooding back. But something made her take a step closer instead of turning back. The man was unconscious, his head hanging down so she couldn't see his face clearly. His clothes were torn and dirty, and she could see dark stains that looked like dried blood. Someone had bound his hands behind the post with rough rope tied tight enough to cut into his wrists. His feet were bare, and she could see they were cut and swollen. He was Indian. She could tell that much from his clothes and the way his hair was braided. But he didn't look like the fierce warriors from the stories that traveled through town. He looked hurt, maybe dying. Mary stood there for what felt like forever, her mind racing. Every practical thought told her to walk away, to pretend she'd never seen him. Indians meant trouble, everyone knew that. If someone had tied him up and left him here, there was probably a good reason. But then she saw his chest move slightly with a shallow breath, and something inside her shifted. This wasn't a warrior or a threat. This was just a man, hurt and helpless, left to die slowly in the cold. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd always said that doing right wasn't always the same as doing what was safe or easy. She thought about her own children, asleep in their beds just that morning, and what she'd want someone to do if they ever found Lucy or Ben hurt and abandoned. Mary took another step closer. The man's face was swollen and bruised, but she could see he was probably around Thomas's age, maybe a little younger. There were older scars mixed with the fresh injuries, telling a story of a hard life. But his breathing was steady, and when she looked closer, she could see that someone had cared for him recently. His hair was clean, and his clothes, though torn now, had been well made. The sun was getting higher, and she knew the children would start worrying if she didn't come back soon. But she also knew that if she walked away now, this man would be dead by nightfall. The temperature was supposed to drop again once the sun went down. Mary looked back toward her cabin, then at the man tied to her fence. She thought about all the reasons why helping him was dangerous, foolish, maybe even deadly for her and her children. Then she thought about the reasons why leaving him to die was something she'd never be able to live with. She set down the tool bag and started working on the knots. Mary's hands shook as she worked at the tight knots. The rope was rough and had been pulled so tight it had cut into the man's wrists, leaving dark marks on his skin. Whoever had tied him here hadn't meant for him to get free. They'd meant for him to die. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, but her fingers kept working at the rope. "Thomas, what would you do?" The wind picked up, making her shawl flutter around her shoulders. In the distance, she could hear one of the children calling her name, probably wondering why she was taking so long. She had to hurry. Finally, the last knot came loose. The man slumped forward, and Mary barely caught him before he hit the ground. He was heavier than she'd expected, all muscle and bone, but lighter than Thomas had been. She could feel how thin he was under his torn shirt. Getting him back to the cabin was going to be impossible. He was unconscious and too heavy for her to carry that far, but she couldn't leave him out here either. The barn was closer, maybe 100 yards away. If she could get him there, she could figure out what to do next. Mary looked around and spotted Thomas's old wheelbarrow near the fence line, left over from when he'd been fixing posts last summer. It took all her strength to get the unconscious man into it, and even then she had to stop twice on the way to the barn to rest her arms. The barn was warm and quiet, with hay scattered on the floor and the familiar smell of animals and leather. Mary managed to get the man into an empty stall at the back, the one Thomas used to use for sick animals. She spread some clean hay around him and covered him with an old horse blanket. Now that she could see him clearly in the barn's dim light, she realized just how badly hurt he was. Besides the rope burns on his wrists, he had a deep cut across his left shoulder and what looked like boot prints bruised into his ribs. His face was swollen, and there was dried blood in his dark hair. "Mama!" Lucy's voice came from outside the barn. "Mama, where are you?" Mary's heart jumped. She couldn't let the children see this man, not yet. They were already scared enough about everything, and finding an injured Indian in their barn would terrify them. "I'm coming, sweetheart," she called back, quickly pulling the barn door shut behind her as she stepped outside. Lucy was standing by the cabin, looking worried. "You were gone a long time. Ben was asking for you. I'm sorry, honey. The fence was worse than I thought. Why don't you and Ben stay inside today? It's too cold out here." Lucy nodded and ran back toward the cabin. Mary watched her go, her mind racing. What was she going to do now? She had an unconscious man hidden in her barn, and she had no idea if he was going to live or die. She didn't even know why someone had tied him up in the first place. Maybe he was dangerous. Maybe he'd done something terrible and this was his punishment. But looking at him lying there, hurt and helpless, she couldn't imagine him hurting anyone. Mary spent the rest of the morning trying to act normal around the children. She helped Ben with his reading and listened to Lucy practice her arithmetic. But her mind kept wandering to the barn, wondering if the man was still alive, wondering what she was going to do if he woke up. After lunch, she told the children she needed to check on Bessie and slipped back out to the barn. The man was exactly where she'd left him, still unconscious but breathing steadily. She knelt down beside him and tried to remember what she'd done when Thomas was sick, clean the wounds. First, that's what the doctor in town always said. Mary went to the house and gathered some clean rags and a bowl of warm water. She also brought the bottle of whiskey Thomas had kept for medicinal purposes. There wasn't much left, but it would have to do. Cleaning the cuts was harder than she'd expected. The man stirred a few times when she touched the deeper wounds, making soft groaning sounds, but he didn't wake up. The cut on his shoulder was the worst. It looked like it had been made with a knife, and it was going to need stitching. Mary had sewn up cuts on animals before, but never on a person. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle, and she had to stop several times to steady herself. The man's breathing stayed even throughout, though she could see pain cross his face even in unconsciousness. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. She covered him with the blanket again and went back to the house, wondering what would happen when he woke up. That night, after the children were asleep, Mary lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every sound outside made her jump, the wind in the trees, Bessie moving around in her pen, a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. What if someone came looking for the man? What if they found him in her barn? What would happen to her children then? She must have finally fallen asleep, because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the window and Lucy was shaking her shoulder. "Mama, there's someone in the barn." Mary's blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "I went to get eggs, and I heard someone moving around in there. It sounded like they were hurt." Mary got dressed quickly and followed Lucy outside. At the barn door, she could hear it too, soft sounds of movement, maybe someone trying to sit up. He was awake. "Lucy, I want you to take Ben and go inside. Stay there until I come get you, understand?" "But Mama, no arguments. Go now." Lucy's eyes were wide, but she obeyed, running back toward the cabin. Mary took a deep breath and opened the barn door. The man was sitting up against the wall of the stall, the blanket pulled around his shoulders. His dark eyes watched her carefully as she approached, alert but not threatening. There was intelligence in those eyes and something else, surprise, maybe even gratitude. "You," he said in English, though his accent was thick. "You help me." His voice was rough, probably from thirst and the cold night. Mary nodded slowly, staying where she was. She'd brought a cup of water from the house, and she set it down within his reach. "Drink," she said simply. He reached for the cup with hands that shook slightly, and Mary could see the rope burns on his wrists were still angry and red. He drank slowly, watching her over the rim of the cup. "Why?" he asked when he finished. It was a simple question, but Mary didn't have a simple answer. Why had she helped him? Why had she risked her children's safety for a stranger? "You were hurt," she said finally. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if that answer made sense to him. "My name," he said, touching his chest, "is John." The name sounded strange in his accent, like it wasn't the name he was born with, but one he'd learned to use. "Mary," she replied, though she stayed near the door, ready to run if she needed to. "Mary," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Thank you, Mary." They looked at each other in the dim light of the barn, two strangers brought together by circumstances neither of them had chosen. Mary thought about all the stories she'd heard about Indians, about the dangers and the violence. But sitting here looking at this hurt man who thanked her for simple kindness, those stories seemed very far away. "Are you hungry?" she asked. John nodded, and Mary saw something like relief cross his face. Maybe he'd expected her to leave him to starve or worse. "I'll bring something," she said, "but you have to stay hidden. If anyone sees you, I know," John said quietly. "I understand." As Mary walked back toward the house, she realized that everything had changed. Yesterday she was just a widow trying to survive the winter with her children. Today she was harboring a man who someone had tried to kill, and she still didn't know why, but as she looked back at the barn, she knew she'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, she could live with helping someone who needed help. She wasn't sure she could have lived with walking away. 3 days passed before John was strong enough to stand without swaying. Mary had been bringing him food twice a day, leftover biscuits, soup made from chicken bones, water from the well. Each time she entered the barn, she half expected to find him gone, but he was always there, sitting quietly in the hay. On the 4th morning, she found him on his feet, examining the broken harness that hung on the barn wall. "This can be fixed," he said, running his fingers along the cracked leather. "You need it for plowing?" Mary nodded, surprised. Thomas had broken that harness last spring and never got around to fixing it. She'd been dreading the cost of buying a new one. "I show you," John said, settling back down with the harness in his lap. His hands moved skillfully as he began working the leather, using techniques Mary had never seen before that afternoon. When she brought him lunch, John had something else to show her. He'd carved a small wooden bird from a piece of scrap wood, complete with tiny feathers etched into its wings. "For your children," he said, holding it out to her. "They must wonder why you come here so much." Mary took the wooden bird, surprised by how smooth and detailed it was. "How did you know? I hear them playing." "The girl, she worries about you. The boy, he wants to help with everything." John's English was getting clearer each day, as if he was remembering words he'd learned long ago. "They are good children." That evening, Mary showed the wooden bird to Lucy and Ben. Their eyes lit up with wonder. "Where did this come from, Mama?" Lucy asked, turning it over in her small hands. "Someone made it," Mary said carefully. "Someone who wanted you to have it." "Can we meet them?" Ben asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Mary looked at her children's eager faces and made a decision that scared her. "Maybe tomorrow." The next morning she brought both children to the barn. John was sitting in the stall, and when he saw them, he smiled, the first real smile Mary had seen from him. "You must be Lucy," he said to the girl, who was hiding halfway behind her mother's skirt. "And Ben," he added, looking at the boy who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes. Are you an Indian? Ben asked with the bluntness that only children possess. Ben, Mary scolded, but John chuckled. Yes, I am. My people call themselves Comanche. Do you know this word? Both children shook their heads. It means enemy to everyone, John said, then saw Mary's worried expression. But I am not enemy to your mother. She saved my life. Lucy stepped out from behind Mary's skirt. Did someone hurt you? John nodded seriously. Yes, bad men. But your mama, she helped me get better. Can you make more animals? Ben asked, pointing to the wooden bird Lucy still held. John's smile widened. Many animals. Would you like to learn? And that's how it began. What started as necessity slowly became something else. John's wounds healed, but he didn't leave. Mary told herself it was because winter was getting worse, because he was still too weak to travel. But the truth was, she didn't want him to go. He fixed things around the farm that had been broken since Thomas died. The loose board on the chicken coop, the squeaky hinge on the barn door, the gap in the cabin wall that let cold air in at night. He did it all quietly, without being asked, using skills Mary didn't know existed. How do you know so much about building? She asked one day, watching him repair the roof over Bessie's stall. John paused in his work. My father was Mexican. He worked with wood, stone, leather. He taught me before. He didn't finish the sentence, but Mary heard the sadness in his voice. What happened to him? Soldiers came to our village when I was young. My father, he tried to protect my mother, but... John shrugged, a gesture that said more than words could. Mary felt her heart clench. She'd been so worried about John being dangerous that she hadn't considered he might have lost as much as she had. Maybe more. Winter deepened, and with it came problems Mary couldn't solve on her own. The well started freezing at night, making it hard to get water in the mornings. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls, making it impossible to keep warm. One morning, they woke up to find that something had gotten into the chicken coop and killed 2 of their hens. Each time John had an answer. He showed Mary how to wrap the well pipe with old cloth to keep it from freezing. He mixed mud and grass to fill the cracks in the walls, a technique he'd learned from his mother's people. He built a better latch for the chicken coop and set traps for the fox that had been stealing their birds. Where did you learn all this? Mary asked, watching him work on the chicken coop. Many places, John said. Comanche village, Mexican ranch, white man's farm. When you belong nowhere, you learn to do everything. His words hit Mary like a cold wind. You don't belong nowhere, she said quietly. You belong here, with us. John stopped working and looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he nodded and went back to fixing the latch. The children grew more attached to John each day. He taught Lucy how to braid leather strips into rope. He showed Ben how to whistle like different birds. In the evenings, he told them stories about coyotes and eagles, about brave warriors and wise grandmothers. Stories that were nothing like the frightening tales Mary had heard about Indians in town. But it wasn't all easy. There were moments when Mary caught John staring off toward the horizon, a look of deep sadness on his face. Sometimes she heard him talking to himself in his own language, words that sounded like prayers or maybe goodbyes. Do you miss them? She asked one evening after the children had gone to bed. They were sitting by the fire, John repairing a bridle while Mary mended one of Ben's shirts. Miss who? Your people, your tribe. John was quiet for so long that Mary thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, I miss the way things were before. But my people, they do not miss me. Why not? Another long silence. Then John set down the bridle and looked directly at her. I would not fight against settlers anymore. Too much killing, too much hate. My chief said I was weak, said I forgot who I was. So they cast me out. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold, the men who tied you to the fence. My own brothers, John said simply. They thought leaving me to die would be better than letting me shame the tribe by living among white people. But you weren't living among white people when they found you. No, I was trying to find a place where I could live in peace. There is no such place for someone like me. Mary set down her sewing and looked at this man who had become so important to her life, to her children's lives. A man who had been rejected by his own people for refusing to kill, who had nearly died because he chose peace over violence. "There is now," she said, that night. As Mary lay in bed listening to the wind howl outside, she realized how much everything had changed. A few weeks ago, she was struggling to survive alone, overwhelmed by tasks she didn't know how to do. Now she had help, real help, from someone who understood the land better than she ever would. But more than that, she had companionship. Someone to talk to after the children went to bed, someone who listened when she talked about Thomas, someone who understood loss and loneliness. The next morning brought a new challenge. Mary woke up to find that the latest storm had blown down a section of fence on the east side of the property. If Bessie got out, they might never find her in all that open country. "I'll fix it," John said when she told him about the problem. "It's too much work for one person," Mary replied. "Thomas always said fence work was a two-person job." John looked at her for a moment, then smiled. "Then we worked together." They spent the whole day rebuilding the fence. John showed Mary how to dig post holes that wouldn't shift in the wind, how to stretch wire tight enough to keep animals in, but not so tight it would snap in cold weather. Mary had never done this kind of work before, and her hands were blistered by the end of the day, but she felt proud of what they'd accomplished together. "Good work," John said as they looked at the new fence line in the fading light. "We make a good team," Mary replied, and meant it. That night, for the first time since Thomas died, Mary fell asleep without worrying about all the things that might go wrong tomorrow. She had a partner again, someone she could count on. It might not be the life she'd planned, but it was a good life, and that was more than she'd dared hope for just a few weeks ago. Spring came early that year, bringing with it the first real warmth Mary had felt in months. The ice on the well melted, wildflowers started pushing through the brown grass, and Bessie began giving more milk. For the first time since Thomas died, Mary felt hopeful about the future. John had been with them for nearly 3 months now, and it was hard to remember what life had been like without him. He'd become part of their daily routine, helping with morning chores, teaching the children new skills, sharing meals and stories by the fire each evening. But with the warmer weather came visitors, and visitors meant questions Mary wasn't ready to answer. The first was old Pete Morrison, a traveling merchant who came by every few months selling supplies and carrying news from town. Mary saw his wagon coming from a mile away and quickly sent the children to find John, who disappeared into the woods behind the barn. "Morning, Mary," Pete called out, climbing down from his wagon. "How are you folks making out?" "We're doing fine, Pete. Better than expected." Pete looked around the farm with a puzzled expression. "Place looks good, real good. That fence work over there looks new, and I swear your barn's in better shape than last time I came through." Mary's heart started beating faster. "I've been keeping busy. Must be. Takes a strong back to do that kind of work." Pete's eyes lingered on the neat repairs around the property. "You been getting help from the Johnsons?" "Here and there," Mary said, which wasn't exactly a lie. The Johnsons had helped some, just not with the things Pete was noticing. Pete nodded, but Mary could tell he wasn't convinced. Merchants made their living by paying attention to details, and Pete had keen eyes. After he left, Mary found John sitting by the creek, watching the water flow over the rocks. "I heard," he said before she could speak, "he suspects something." "Maybe. But Pete's not a troublemaker. He minds his own business." John picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. "For now, but people talk, especially when they see things that don't make sense." That evening, as they sat around the fire, John seemed different, quieter than usual, distant. The children didn't notice, but Mary did. She'd learned to read his moods, to see the worry lines around his eyes when something was bothering him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked after Lucy and Ben had gone. "To bed? Maybe I should go?" John said simply. Mary felt like someone had just punched her in the stomach. "Go? Why?" "You know why. People are starting to notice. Questions will lead to more questions, and then—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew what would happen if the wrong people found out about him. "This is your home now," Mary said, surprised by the fierceness in her own voice. John looked at her and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the same look Thomas used to give her, warm and tender and full of feelings that were hard to put into words. "Is it?" he asked quietly. Before Mary could answer, they heard horses outside, multiple horses, moving fast. John was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the knife he always wore at his belt. "Stay here," he whispered, but Mary was already moving toward the window. Through the curtains, she could see 4 riders in the moonlight. They'd stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to watch, but far enough away to run if they needed to. One of them pointed toward the barn, saying something she couldn't hear. "Indians," John whispered, coming up beside her. "Comanche," Mary's blood turned to ice. "Your people?" "Some of them." John's face was grim. "They've come for me." The next morning brought no relief. The riders were still there, camped just at the edge of Mary's property line. They made no move to approach the cabin, but their message was clear. They were waiting. John spent the day pacing like a caged animal. He wouldn't eat, barely spoke to the children, and kept checking the windows every few minutes. "What do they want?" Mary finally asked. "They want me to come back, to face judgment for betraying the tribe. And if you don't?" John was quiet for a long moment. "They will wait and watch. And eventually they will take action." Mary felt a cold fear settle in her stomach. What kind of action? The kind that puts you and your children in danger. That night, Mary lay awake listening to every sound outside. The wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. A coyote's howl made her jump. When morning finally came, she was exhausted and on edge. The situation got worse when neighbor Bill Johnson rode up that afternoon. The Comanche riders melted back into the trees when they saw him coming, but Mary knew they were still watching. "Mary," Bill said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Heard you might have some trouble brewing." "What kind of trouble?" "Pete Morrison was by our place yesterday. Said things looked mighty prosperous over here." "More prosperous than a widow woman should be able to manage on her own?" Bill's eyes swept over the property, taking in all the improvements that had been made over the winter. Mary forced herself to stay calm. "I've been working hard." "I'm sure you have. But Pete also mentioned seeing smoke from your barn at odd hours. And Rachel swears she saw someone moving around your property last week." "Someone who wasn't you or the children." Mary's heart sank. Rachel Johnson had eyes like a hawk and a memory like a steel trap. If she'd seen John, there was no point in denying it. "Bill, I appreciate your concern, but Mary, listen to me." Bill's voice was serious now. "There are stories going around town. Stories about renegade Indians in the area, about settlers going missing. If you're harboring someone, if someone's been threatening you, No one's threatening me," Mary said quickly. Too quickly, Bill studied her face for a long moment. "Where are your children?" "Inside, taking their afternoon rest." "And where's your hired hand?" Mary's mouth went dry. "My what?" "The man who's been doing all this work around here. The one Rachel saw." Bill's hand rested on the gun at his hip, not threatening exactly, but ready. Before Mary could answer, John stepped out from behind the barn. He moved slowly, his hands visible, but Mary could see the tension in every line of his body. "I am here," John said simply. Bill's hand tightened on his gun. "You're Indian, yes. What are you doing on this property?" "Working, living. This woman saved my life." Bill looked back and forth between Mary and John, and Mary could see him putting pieces together. "Mary, do you have any idea how dangerous this is? If word gets out that you're harboring a renegade?" "He's not a renegade," Mary interrupted. "He's a good man who needed help." "A good man?" Bill's voice rose. "Mary, there are Comanche warriors camped not half a mile from here." "You think that's a coincidence?" Mary felt the walls closing in around them. She looked at John, who was standing perfectly still, waiting to see what would happen next. She thought about her children inside the cabin, about the life they'd built together over the winter, about everything they stood to lose. "They're not here because of anything he did wrong," she said finally. "They're here because he chose not to do wrong. He refused to raid settlements, refused to kill innocent people. His own tribe cast him out for it, and you believe him?" Mary looked at John again, at the man who had fixed her fence and taught her children to carve wood, who had held her when she cried about Thomas and never once made her feel afraid. "Yes," she said, "I believe him, and more than that, She paused, suddenly aware that what she was about to say would change everything. "I love him." The words hung in the air like smoke. Bill stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. John's eyes went wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Mary," Bill said slowly, "you can't be serious." "I am serious. Dead serious." Mary stepped closer to John, close enough to take his hand. "This man has been kinder to me and my children than anyone since my husband died. He's worked harder on this farm than any hired hand ever would. He's never once raised his voice to the children or shown anything but gentleness and patience. He's still Indian, Mary. People won't stand for it." "Then people will have to learn to stand for it," Mary said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Bill shook his head. "This won't end well for any of you." He mounted his horse and looked down at them. "I won't say anything about this for now. But Mary, you need to think real hard about what you're doing. Those warriors out there aren't going to wait forever. And when they make their move—" He rode away without finishing the threat, but Mary knew what he meant. The waiting was almost over, and soon they would all have to face whatever came next. That night, as John prepared to slip away in the darkness, Mary made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Mary caught John's arm as he headed toward the door. "Where are you going? Away from here, before someone gets hurt." "The only person who's going to get hurt is you, out there alone with those warriors waiting." John gently pulled free from her grip. "Mary, you don't understand. If I stay, they will not just take me. They will make sure everyone knows what you did. Your children will suffer for it. You will lose everything." "I've already lost everything once," Mary said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm not losing it again, not without a fight." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Mary woke to find John still there, sitting by the window, watching the tree line where the Comanche waited. "I thought you'd be gone by now," she said. "I tried, but I could not leave you to face this alone." Before Mary could respond, Lucy came, running from the kitchen. "Mama, there are men coming." Lots of men. Mary's heart sank as she looked out the window. Bill Johnson was riding toward the cabin, and he wasn't alone. 5 other men rode with him, including Pete Morrison and Robert Hayes, who owned the biggest ranch in the county. "Take the children to their room," Mary told John. "Keep them there no matter what happens. Mary, please. I need to know they're safe." John nodded and gathered Lucy and Ben, speaking to them in the calm, gentle voice he always used. Mary heard him tell them it was just grown-up business, nothing for them to worry about. The men stopped their horses in front of the cabin, and Mary stepped outside to meet them. She could see more riders in the distance. The Comanche warriors had moved closer, probably drawn by the sight of so many armed men on their territory. "Mary," Bill said, dismounting, "we need to talk." "Then talk." Robert Hayes, a big man with graying hair and hard eyes, stepped forward. "We hear you've been harboring a hostile Indian on your property. I've been helping an injured man who needed help. That injured man has brought trouble to our whole area," Hayes said. "There are warriors camped out there watching us right now, watching our families, our children." Mary could see fear in the faces of the other men, and she understood. These were farmers and ranchers with wives and children of their own. They'd heard too many stories about Indian raids, about families killed in their beds. "The warriors aren't here because John is dangerous," Mary said. "They're here because he refused to be dangerous. He chose peace over war, and his own people rejected him for it. You call him John?" Pete Morrison shook his head. "Mary, you've been alone too long. This Indian has filled your head with lies." "He's filled my head with kindness," Mary replied. "Something I haven't had much of since my husband died." Hayes' face hardened. "Kindness or not, he's putting all of us at risk. Those warriors out there won't wait much longer. When they make their move, innocent people will die. Then maybe you should talk to them instead of threatening me." "We're not threatening you, Mary," Bill said, though his hand rested on his gun. We're trying to help you see reason. Turn the Indian over to us and we'll make sure he gets a fair trial." Mary almost laughed. A fair trial? For what crime? Surviving? Helping a widow fix her fence? For bringing hostiles to our area? For putting our families in danger? Behind the men, Mary could see movement in the trees. The Comanche warriors were getting restless, probably wondering what all these armed settlers were doing so close to. "Their quarry. He hasn't brought anyone anywhere," Mary said. "Those warriors came here on their own to drag him back to face punishment for refusing to kill people like you." "All the more reason to turn him over," Hayes said. "Let them settle their own business." The cabin door opened and John stepped outside. Mary's heart clenched. She'd hoped he would stay hidden, keep the children safe. But she should have known. He wouldn't let her face this alone. "I am here," John said simply, the same words he'd spoken to Bill Johnson the day before. Hayes' gun was in his hand before Mary could blink. "Don't move, Indian." "Robert, put that away," Bill said, but his own hand was on his weapon. John stood perfectly still, his empty hands visible. "You want me to go with you? We want you gone," Hayes said. "One way or another, then I will go." John looked at Mary, and she saw goodbye in his eyes. "But first, I ask one thing." "You're not in a position to ask for anything," Hayes replied. "Let me speak to my brothers." John nodded toward the tree line. "They wait for me. If I go to them willingly, they will take me and leave this place in peace." Hayes considered this. "And if we just shoot you here and now? Then they will kill everyone. On this land, starting with the women and children. That is their way." Mary felt the color drain from her face. She looked at the hard men surrounding her cabin, then at the shadows moving in the trees beyond. Her children were caught in the middle of something that could turn deadly in seconds. "John, no," she said. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," John replied gently. This was always how it would end, but Mary wasn't ready to give up. Not on the man who had become the most important part of her world, not on the life they'd built together. What if there was another choice? She said, looking directly at Hayes. "What if the warriors left because there was nothing for them to take?" Hayes frowned. "What are you talking about? You said they came for John because he betrayed his tribe. But what if he wasn't John the Outcast anymore? What if he was John Henderson, my husband?" The silence that followed was so complete that Mary could hear her own heartbeat. Every man stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Mary," Bill said slowly, "you can't be serious." "I am serious. Deadly serious." Mary moved to stand beside John, taking his hand in front of all of them. "This man has been more of a husband to me these past months than most women ever get. He's been a father to my children, a partner in all the work that needed doing." "You can't marry an Indian," Hayes said flatly. "Says who? What law says I can't marry the man I choose?" Hayes sputtered, but Mary could see uncertainty in his eyes. The truth was, there probably wasn't a specific law against it, just custom and prejudice. "Even if you could," Pete Morrison said, "it wouldn't solve anything. Those warriors still want him." "Do they?" Mary looked toward the trees. "John, if you were no longer Comanche, if you belonged completely to the white world, would they still have a claim on you?" John was quiet for a long moment. "In their eyes, I would be dead to them, worse than dead." "They would not sully themselves." "By touching me? But they'd leave?" "Yes, they would leave." Mary turned back to the men. "Then that's what we'll do. Right here, right now. Any of you know the words to a wedding ceremony?" Bill Johnson stared at her. "Mary, you're talking about marrying an Indian in front of armed Comanche warriors. This is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Maybe, but it's also the only thing that saves everyone. John goes from being a tribal outcast to being my husband. The warriors lose their claim on him and leave. Your families stay safe. Everyone gets what they want." Hayes looked skeptical. "And what makes you think they'll honor that distinction?" "Because honor is everything to them," John said quietly. "If I am truly white man's family, I am dead to Comanche. They will not waste time on the dead." Mary could see the men thinking it over, weighing the risks. It was a desperate plan, but it might be the only one that didn't end in bloodshed. "I'll do it," Bill said finally. "I've got a Bible in my saddlebags, and I remember enough of my father's preaching to manage the words." Hayes started to object, but Pete Morrison cut him off. "It might work, Robert. And if it doesn't, we're no worse off than we are now." So there, in the yard of her small cabin, with Comanche warriors watching from the trees and armed settlers, forming a circle around them, Mary married the man who had already won her heart. The ceremony was brief and strange, nothing like the church wedding she'd had with Thomas, but when John slipped a ring carved from wood onto her finger, it felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. "You may kiss the bride," Bill said, and John leaned down to brush his lips against hers, gentle and sure. From the trees came the sound of horses moving away. The warriors were leaving, their business finished. John was no longer their concern. As the settlers prepared to leave, Hayes paused beside Mary. "I hope you know what you're doing." "I do," Mary said, looking at her new husband. "For the first time in a long time, I know exactly what I'm doing." That evening, as they sat by the fire with Lucy and Ben curled up between them, Mary thought about second chances and the strange ways they sometimes came. She'd lost one husband to fever and found another tied to her fence post. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life she'd chosen, and that made all the difference. A year later, as Mary held their new baby daughter while John taught Lucy and Ben to ride horses, she realized that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. Love didn't always look the way you thought it would, but when you found it, you held on tight and never let go.